we're talking about whether we can believe what's coming out of Trump's mouth. We certainly can't believe anything that's coming out of Putin's mouth.
I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battlelines. It's Friday, 10th of July, 2025. On today's episode, I'm joined by Hamish de Bretton-Gordon to discuss Trump's changing tone on Putin, Russian chemical attacks on Ukraine, and the state of Syria's new government. Hamish is a veteran British Army officer who served for 23 years. He was commander of the UK's chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear defence forces and a similar battalion within NATO. He's also the co-founder and director of Doctors Under Fire, which helps civilians with the threat from chemical weapons. And, of course, he's a regular contributor to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest, and a columnist for The Telegraph. Hamish, welcome to Battlelines. So lots I want to talk to you about, lots that you've been working on and writing about. Maybe we could start with Trump's comments this week. We get a lot of bullshit thrown at us by Putin, if you want to know the truth. He's very nice all the time, but it turns out to be meaningless. Not really a surprise to you or I, but what do you make of his apparent change in tone?
Well, we're getting very used to Trump really changing his tone and his position on an almost daily basis. But this seems pretty significant. I think he suddenly realized that that Putin has been playing him for some time. To a lot of us who've been following this very closely, Putin has been messaging so clearly that he has absolutely no interest in peace in Ukraine. You know, his stated objectives before he started his 3-day special military operation on the 24th of February 2022 was to completely subjugate Ukraine. And he's a very long way from that. He knows that if he doesn't do that, you know, his longevity in post are pretty limited. So he's been playing Trump along, and Trump until very recently, they seem to have been almost, I wouldn't say friends or pals, but I think Trump's suggesting they sort of speak the same language, but he seems to have suddenly realized with his bullshit comment that that's exactly what Putin has been feeding him. And then yesterday also, we had the leaked audio from when Trump, he wasn't president, but a few years ago, when apparently he told Putin that if he invaded Ukraine, he would, I think, in inverted commas, bomb Moscow to shit. When you put these two things together, and you know why is it important? Do we, we don't. Trump hasn't woken up today, or he hasn't said anything today. Is it going to be something slightly different? To me, the Moscow piece is important because Trump knows that he could probably do that now after the Iranian adventure. So let's hope that this is a bit of an awakening with Trump. I'm sure we'll talk about sanctions and everything else. There's an awful lot going on at the moment. As far as the Europeans go, we know we've got Macron in London this week, but the European NATO countries have been pretty quiet since the summit a few weeks ago when they said, yeah, we're going to spend 5% on defense. We're absolutely up it. Putin beware. But it's all gone a little bit quiet. So I think we're holding our breath that Trump really is leaning into this. But we've got to know over his 2 terms, and certainly this term so far as president, that he changes his mind on more often than the wind changes direction.
Well, that's it, right? I mean, it is encouraging language, but it's just that language. And we had this weapons shipment pause to Ukraine, which we think was just done by the Pentagon, by Pete Hegseth, without Trump's knowledge. That was then restarted, but that's been taken as an encouraging sign. But those weapons had been signed off ages ago. It was supposed to be delivered. They were going through Poland, I believe. And the shipment was slimmed down. I heard somewhere from 30 Patriots to 10 Patriots. So the actual concrete evidence of any kind of shift is not really there, right?
You can almost read into what you want to about these things. I mean, the shipment cancellation does sort of give the impression that maybe Trump has not really got his finger absolutely on the pulse of what's going on, and he's looking left and right, but always looking to make some sort of statement to flex his muscles and his brilliance as a leader, and that is a real concern, because I think the main thing, what perhaps Trump doesn't understand, and I suppose those of us who have been on battlefields frequently, is the psychological impact of some of the decisions he's making. On the battlefield, your mind is almost a bigger weapon than the rifle you hold or the bomb that's been fired at you. and that is something that Trump needs to understand. So when it is apparent that the Americans are stopping arms shipments to Ukraine, that has a massive psychological impact on the Ukrainian defenders. Conversely, it has a real positive impact in the Kremlin because they suddenly think it's off. So turning it back on again, yeah, sure, it might not be the right amount of patriots, but psychologically, Ukraine needs to know that the Americans are behind them. And also in the Kremlin, and another piece I wrote this week about the Kremlin is actually there are rumbles of discontent that may develop further. But again, we always say as soldiers, psychology as to physical as 10 is to 1. And politicians really need to understand that.
I guess another part of the psychology, which you mentioned briefly earlier, is sanctions. And we're waiting to see if this sanctions bill that Senator Lindsey Graham has been pushing very hard for will actually get put on the floor to be voted on. It's got the support of something like 80 senators, I believe, cross-party support, but Trump has been very hesitant to back it. He did say this week that he's looking very strongly at it. Do you think that's an encouraging sign?
Well, it's certainly more encouraging than what he's been saying hitherto, that he's prevaricated, and of course, until last week, we thought that he was sucking from the hydrant of the stuff that's coming out of Putin's mouth. But these sanctions could be really significant. They're talking about 500% sanctions on anybody who buys Russian oil, and we know that's pretty much China and the Indians now. If they stop buying Russian oil, then Putin's coffers are going to empty pretty quickly. And not even Putin, not even the Russians can build tanks and ammunition and drones without, semiconductors from China and without hard currency. I mean, there is this sort of false view that Putin can just do what he likes and keeps on, making stuff. He can't. The sanctions issue is huge. I mean, if Trump does nothing else but get the sanctions going, then that could have a huge impact on the direction of this war.
You wrote this week that you think Russia may be at its 1934 moment. Can you explain that?
In 1934, in effect, Stalin had a lot of his leaders, or a lot of those people who were significant in the military and politically murdered under what was called the purges. And what that created then was it absolutely solidifies Stalin's position, but it put Russia in a really difficult position. And what we have been seeing recently, the reason I say 1934 is because I think everybody who listens or watches the news is aware that a lot of Russian leaders fall out of balconies and die mysteriously. And
shoot themselves in cars with guns that they were given by the Kremlin.
Well, absolutely. I'm talking to you from Salisbury, where, of course, Russian hitmen tried to murder the double agent Sergei Skripal. This is the sort of things that Russians do. And the FSB, who are in effect the Russian sort of MI5, which is where Putin came from, ruled the roost, a bit like Stalin and his purges. So all these senior people, a lot of generals have been removed from post or actually killed themselves. Prigozhin, who was the great mercenary leader who started to march on Moscow, his jet fell out of the air. So there has been increasing things. And of course, add on to that, the SBU, the Ukraine Secret Service, have also assassinated a number of key Russian leaders. And only this week, as you say, the transport minister mysteriously died when his own pistol went off in his face. And then one of the key oligarchs who run the sort of gold business in Russia tried to flee Moscow in his private jet and was arrested. And there is this undercurrent that a lot of these people are getting eliminated, removed, and actually it's a bit of a sort of piece about the whole Russian military. The professional Russian army was destroyed in the first 6 months of the war, and now it is very much sort of conscripts. And Putin's had to buy 30,000 souls from North Korea to keep his meat grinder going. But what it also means, you've got a lot of inexperienced people. And if I use the military analogy, you need experience on the battlefield, particularly if you're going to do anything except march straight towards the enemy and fight. In order to do sort of maneuver and smart operations, for instance, as we saw the Ukrainians do in Kursk last year, you need to do a lot of training and experience. Now, Russia just doesn't have that militarily now. So the only way it can keep going forward is by some, suicide type activities, but keep throwing people into this meat grinder. In a similar sort of guise, when it comes to senior Russian politicians, the fact that they've been removed at such rapid rate means that the people replacing them are usually just the people that Putin would trust, who not necessarily have the experience and the wherewithal to carry out these jobs, which again is going back to an autocratic tyrant like Putin. One of the big issues he has, he likes to make all the decisions, be it financial or political, but also militarily. Even frontline commanders at relatively low level in the Russian army are terrified to make any decisions and pass it up what we call the chain of command. And ultimately, Putin is making some pretty minor tactical decisions, but he's making them sort of 3 days too late, because that's the time it gets there. And this sort of personifies, very long answer to your question, but I think that it's really becoming all about Putin, because anybody with experience or dynamism is being removed, and certainly anybody who fails is being removed. Who on earth wants to be the transport minister now when you know that your chances of ending up with a bullet in your head are pretty high?
We've been prophesying the fall of the Russian regime and sort of a proper challenge to Putin for several years now. We've been talking about the economy getting worse, and yet somehow he's managed to put the economy on a war footing, and it seems to be working. We've been talking about the lowering skills and capabilities of the Russian army, and yet he always manages to find more people. We've been talking about the strength of his government, and yet he seems to find more ministers who just agree with him, and he keeps doing what he wants. He doesn't seem really any weaker, does he, today than he did 2 years ago?
Well, I'm not sure, but I mean, you make a very good point. This is the Russian way. It's very difficult for us in a sort of Western democracy to understand exactly what's going on there. The Russians lost 26 million people in the Second World War. Britain lost 345,000. The psyche to be able to do that is something completely out with our understanding. The other thing about the Russian regime is corruption is absolutely enterred in their bones, and because of that, again, it creates the sort of inertia. But it's a bit like the security minister, the transport minister, and others who make a fortune out of their jobs through corruption, which is why there's always somebody who's prepared to step into that path. But is Putin any weaker? Well, his military certainly is, I think, and with 1 million casualties already, to try and keep that going. And the other thing, why aren't the babushkas, why aren't the mothers of Russia marching on the Kremlin? They did in the 1980s when Russia lost 17,000, the Soviet Union lost 17,000 soldiers in Afghanistan, and they forced the Kremlin to withdraw. So that is incongruous. But speaking to real experts in this area, who tell me, well, a lot of people view Russian soldiers now as mercenaries, not people fighting for the fatherland, as it were. Because if you're a Russian soldier, you get paid about double, if not triple, the national wage. And when everybody else can't even afford to buy potatoes, you've got the soldiers on the front line who, in effect, are earning a fortune, and therefore the sort of rank and file in Russia, don't think much to them. But again, why isn't that affecting Putin? Because he's an autocratic tyrant, and people know that if you stand up against Putin, you're going to get slotted. I mean, it seems almost too binary to explain, but that is it. The final thing I'd say on this is, the control of the media, which we must find, I think we find unbelievable how in this age of social media, when we know everything in a trice, why isn't this happening across Russia? Well, because even now they do seem to manage to control the media. And I just look, at my own columns in the Telegraph, when in the comments section, I know that a great many of the comments are coming straight out of Russia from John Smith and Pete Taylor and God knows who else, who are trying to change the narrative. And again, that is exactly what they do in Russia. to change the narrative. But again, I think there is, when you listen to people like Steve Rosenberg, the BBC's correspondent in Moscow, he pretty much is over this, and the sort of mood music in the Moscow press in particular is, it's becoming far more critical. It's becoming a bit more questioning, whether those editors are going to last long. But there is this sort of mood. So I think one's not expecting Putin's pack of cards to fall over tomorrow, but I think they are more wobbly than they were 2 years ago. So a really long answer to your question. Yeah, I think Putin is under more pressure than he was 2 years ago, because he has failed to deliver what he promised he would, which is re-subjugating Ukraine and also rebuilding the old Soviet Union. And I think the way that Europe's configured now, there is no way he can do that. And he is yet to argue that in any great way to the Russian people. So yeah, I think his ice is getting thinner.
Let's talk a bit about Ukraine. You've written about how Russia is ramping up its use of chemical weapons. And I think this is something that some people may have heard a bit about, but not fully understand how they're using it, almost sort of World War II style, right? Can you talk us through what they're doing and how it's working?
This is my area of experience. So I suppose I'm shouting about it rather loud than everybody else. And, to me, this should be absolutely headline news. And it's not sort of Second World. This is First World War. Chloropicrin, the chemical weapon, it's a choking agent. It was the first chemical weapon used in the First World War. And actually, it had the impact in the First World War as it's happening on the front line today. Second Battle of Ypres in April 2015, the Germans dropped a whole lot of chlorine, actually, and some chloropicrin on the Allies. And it was devastating because they hadn't really seen it before. And the way to mitigate this is with a respirator, with a gas mask. And very quickly, the Allies got gas masks. And then there was this ramping up. And that is a concern, because then the Allies and the Germans made more and more toxic and virulent chemical weapons. And that's something that perhaps we can come back to. But as far as what's happening in the front line at the moment, last December, the Ukraine government sent a report to the UN and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which is the UN watchdog who is tasked with doing this, claiming that the Russians had used gas, chloropicrin, riot control agents thousands of times. Again, in April this year, they updated it. And I think they were talking about 9,000 events. And only last week, the German and the Dutch Secret Service issued a report saying they had evidence that there were thousands of uses. I have been in touch with a lot of the frontline brigades, giving them some help. Some Saturdays I speak to these brigades, they've been hit 3 or 4 times that day. And how it manifests itself, it is straight out of the Russian chemical weapons playbook. And in my time in Syria, when I was trying to uncover and show that Assad was using chemical weapons, I sort of saw the Russian playbook. It's very cynical. They start off by dropping a whole lot of artillery fire on the trenches. So the contact line, the trenches between the Ukrainians and the Russians, 800 miles long. So the artillery fire gets people down in their foxholes. Then you have these masses of drones with canisters of chloropicrin that they drop into the trench. These canisters explode, spread the gas all through the trenches, and because it's heavier than air, it sinks into the trench and into the foxholes. It's really unpleasant stuff. It's not generally fatal unless you have a underlying medical issue, but you just can't hang around. Any soldier who's been in a gas chamber to check their respirator and has had a whiff of this stuff knows how unpleasant it is. So it means that the soldiers have to get out of the trench.
What are we talking? Like they're sort of unable to breathe properly? Does it have any longer lasting physical effects? What does it actually do to people?
Well, you can't breathe. It's a choking agent. Basically, the chemistry is that the chloropicrin acts with the fluid in your lungs and inflames it. Really, really unpleasant. It acts with the fluid in your eyes, your mouth, and stings. And anybody who's been caught in a riot will have an understanding what it's like. You have to get out of there. You can't stay in there. The Russians follow up with more artillery fire and also some direct fire. But this stuff is non-persistent. It only lasts for 5 or 10 minutes. So the Russians take a few trenches, the gas goes, and the Ukrainians retake them. So it's not having a profound effect, but it is having a real impact. And going back to the First World War scenario, if the Russians decided to escalate, well, Novichok, Salisbury, where I'm talking to you from, if they use Novichok, which is the most deadly chemical man has ever made, which is a nerve agent, that could kill thousands and thousands of people. And to sort of wrap this up, Anisha, why the Russians doing it? Because it's effective, and because a lot of people don't think that CS, gas or riot control agent is a chemical weapon, but it is. It's illegal under the Chemical Weapons Convention because it replicates exactly what a chemical weapon would do. And I think that is the issue. The final sort of adjunct to this is the way to get around it is with a really good respirator, a gas mask. And actually, the British government announced, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, that they were sending thousands of British gas masks, and Britain is actually the best and leading producers of respirators in the world. They do it for the American military, the British military, and all NATO countries. So people like me have been screaming at the government really for the last 18 months when the Russians started using this stuff. But at least now that is gone. The concern is whether they decide to escalate and use something more deadly. Hopefully not. But because people are not talking about it, it's not a huge issue. And Starmer and Macron are not talking about chemical weapon use in Ukraine. They're talking about a whole lot of other things. And actually, they're talking about how Britain and France are going to become nuclear entente cordiale, as it were, which I think is very good. But the point being is people aren't shouting about this stuff as they should be.
We'll get onto that nuclear entente cordiale in a second, but what more should be being done to tackle this? I know Britain issued some fresh sanctions on someone involved in Russia's chemical weapons program earlier this week.
To me, it goes back to the Obama red line. People might remember that in September 2012, Obama said if chemical weapons were used in Syria, that would cross a red line and the Americans would get involved. I'm probably too close to the problem because I was in Syria seeing it happen, and I charged around Whitehall and the Palace of Westminster, telling MPs this was happening. And then we had that dreadful vote in Parliament in September 2013 when Ed Miliband's Labour Party decided that we shouldn't do anything to stop Assad using chemical weapons, which he did for another 10 years, and it kept him in power. And, apart from Syria, Putin saw this. And I think Putin, when he realized the West weren't interested, then first of all, I think it's one of the reasons he invaded Ukraine in the first place, because he didn't think the West would do anything. And because we did very little about Assad's chemical weapons, which are morbidly brilliant weapons. I often say if you have no morals or scruples, you'd use them all of the time. And, certainly Putin doesn't have any of those. So again, I think that is the issue. The key thing is it's got to be called out. The Organization of the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons have removed 95% of chemical weapons from the planet. Unfortunately, people like Russia, and Putin stated in September 2017 that Russia got rid of all its chemical weapons, and weren't Britain and America so awful not to get rid of theirs? And then, of course, a few months later, he dropped Novichok in Salisbury to try and kill Sergei Skripal. So, I mean, it just personifies that we're talking about whether we can believe what's coming out of Trump's mouth. We certainly can't believe anything that's coming out of Putin's mouth.
You brought up Syria, so let's talk a bit about that because it's a big area of expertise for you. Last time we had you on battlelines at the beginning of this year, you'd just come back from a trip there and you were, I think, elated. Is that the right word to say? You were really filled with hope and optimism. How are you feeling now? Quite a lot has happened in that intervening time. Sanctions have been lifted by the US, by the UK. We had David Lammy there last weekend meeting Ahmed al-Sharaa. How are you feeling now? What do you think about the progress that's been made over the last 6 months or not made?
Well, I'm still pretty elated. And I saw a lot of Syrians actually in London 2 weeks ago who a lot of the British Syrian diaspora that I've spoken about a lot, who are so influential in Syria, who are now going backwards and forwards. Quite a lot of people have gone back to Syria. It's great that the Foreign Secretary has been there recently. But I still feel that we could do an awful lot more. I've been shouting that we should have the British embassy open in Damascus and I won't go into details about sort of reactions from the Foreign Office, but talk about risk
Please do.
assessment. Well, talk
I see.
about risk
Considered too dangerous for
assessments
them. Okay.
and not having buildings and stuff. And I'm going, look, I know a Syrian British diaspora who will give us a building free of charge in Damascus, and I don't need a squadron of SAS looking after me there, sort of thing. So I think that's slightly frustrating. But Anne Snow, the British representative of Syria, I think she's doing a great job and getting in there. But a lot of it is about resources, and with a lot of the foreign aid budget now has been cut or turned into defence, which is not a bad thing. I mean, soft power is a key part of defence diplomacy. So, I'd be quite happy to see the defence budget spent supporting things in Syria, because a bit of soft power now could save a hell of a lot of hard power later. And I think, people are, certainly in this country, that they are quite, I understand they're looking elsewhere. Ukraine and the Russians are the big threat to us. Leave Syria to somebody else. What I've been trying to knock down the doors in Westminster and Whitehall is to get people to understand what influence Britain has, mainly because of the Syrian diaspora who came here in the last 20 years, the last 10 years, the Syrian diaspora set up the health service in Idlib, where I was working with people like David Knott. That is now, Sharat wants that replicated across the whole of Syria. And, a lot of British Syrians are helping them do that. The White Helmets, Radi Said, who set it up. And again, Britain was key to setting out. I had a small part in it. But the White Helmets are now being tasked to replicate emergency services across the whole of Syria. And, this is all a British plan. So I feel... I'm still positive. I know there have been a few issues. There has been a few outbreaks of internal fighting, but after the devastation, remember Assad killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. There are still pockets of his supporters, so it's not surprising. And then, of course, there is what's happening in Israel, which abuts Syria too. But I am still positive. And I just hope we get more engaged and realize that actually Syria stability has a huge impact. And the final bit on this, Venetia, is Islamic State. That's where they grew up. That's where they ignited. A lot of people are concerned that al-Shabaab is ex-Al-Qaeda Islamic State. Well, I think I mentioned on battlelines when I got back, it was bizarre, having tried to be killed by these people for 10 years. You then go to Damascus and they're asking you for advice. And I think if people like me and Professor David Knott are prepared to accept them, then that should be a pretty good indicator that we need to give them a chance. Because if Syria blows up, then that any stability that we might hope for in the Middle East will be really difficult.
We've obviously got the camps up in northeast Syria run by the Kurds. They're trying to come to some kind of arrangement with Ahmed al-Sharaa for the Syrian government to be able to take over control. But then what happens to these camps? There's thousands of ex-ISIS members, mainly women and children in these camps, who have grown up for, what are we talking, 5-10 years with very little to go on. And they're probably quite radicalized. What happens to these places?
They're in the challenge. It slightly goes back to my earlier points about resources. What Syria needs is resources to be able to. What they need is resources, and they need advice from us on how to do this sort of stuff. Now, the Americans are pretty much suppressing. The Islamic State fighters are what left of them in the east of the country. But as you say, there are these thousands of people in refugee camps who are a concern. The Kurds, have done a magnificent job. And I was the Iraqi Kurd Peshmerga chemical weapons advisor for 2 years in the fight with ISIS back in sort of 2015, 17. So, I know what brilliant people they are and what great job they do. But without resources, it's going to be very difficult to do anything apart from, keep these camps running. And I think that's what the Syrian government needs, sort of help here and resources to be able to do it. And when, we are not even prepared to throw a few, £1 million their sort of way, that sort of underlines it. And of course, you would hope the Americans would pour massive amounts of money. Certainly they've lifted the sanctions, and that is really good news. But, again, it comes back to money. I mean, I know that a lot of my Syrian friends are putting a lot of their own money in there, but it's, it doesn't even really touch the surface. It needs a real injection. And I know that, the British government and others are waiting to see, how the new organization sets up. But again, they need advice on security and all that sort of stuff, which I know is on offer. I believe the Saudis are putting quite a lot of money in too. But actually, it does need, what Britain is particularly good at and has been is on the whole, through the foreign aid and development and having it structured properly, and for a whole host of reasons, I expect mainly financial because the budget's gone. We sort of stepped back from there. So I would like to. I know there's so many pulls on the public purse at the moment, but I just feel back to an original point. Soft power now could save a lot of hard power later.
Do you think normalisation with Syria is part of the puzzle here? We know that talks are ongoing at the moment, but of course the Israeli expansion into further parts of the Golan Heights is a sticking point, should we say?
Yeah, it is. I mean, this is so complex, and one wouldn't want to try and oversimplify it. But yes, I would like to see normalisation, which is why I like to see an ambassador, British ambassador, in Damascus. That's how you really start to, smell the country, as it were, what's happening, what's moving, what isn't moving. There is the Israeli issue too. But I think, as we discussed when I got back from Syria, a lot of Syrians believe without the Israeli involvement, Assad would never have fallen. Because the Israelis destroyed Hezbollah, who were pretty much helping Assad run the country, and of course with the Iranian situation, it was the Iranian militias and Iranian money that was propping up Assad too. So yes, nothing. It's in all these sort of things. Perfection is the enemy of the good, and we're not going to get the perfection. But in my sort of 40 years on the battlefields of the world, I've come to the conclusion that generally good is good enough, and perfection is, as I said, is the enemy of really getting anything done. But I know for people maybe who haven't been involved in these things, that might sound a pretty trite thing to say, but I suppose real politique is what people should think about.
You mentioned earlier we've got Macron in the UK this week. They've announced a nuclear agreement to share their nuclear weapons program this morning. Can you tell us a bit more about what that would entail and how significant it is?
First of all, I think it's really significant. And I've written quite a lot about this issue. Again, part of my area of expertise. The challenge, first of all, whatever one thinks of the nuclear peace, it has kept the peace for the last 80 years or so. And, it's not perfect, but there's nothing else that would have done it. So I think people just need to sort of understand that. The thing with nuclear confrontation is about parity and equilibrium or balance. And if everything's balanced, then that's great. Nothing will happen because not even Putin wants to see the destruction of the planet because he then can't achieve all the aims. Again, I don't want to sound too trite. However, what we've had really with the war in Ukraine, and particularly with what Trump's been saying, we've had this creation of a nuclear imbalance. Virtually every day since the beginning of the war, Putin or one of his aides, gangsters, have threatened Ukraine and UK in particular with tactical nuclear attack. Why have they done this? They've done it because they know it frightens, or hitherto frightened, some leaders in Europe who held back supporting Ukraine, which is exactly what Putin wanted to achieve, and he did. And from a British perspective, because we only have strategic nuclear weapons, in other words, we have our Trident missiles and our submarines, and one Trident missile would flatten a city sort of thing. And I think the assumption Putin made is he could threaten to use a battlefield, small nuclear device, and Britain would never use a strategic weapon. So I think two really important things have happened in the last sort of 4 weeks. Britain announced it was buying the F-35 Alpha stealth jet, which can carry the American tactical nuclear bomb, something called a B-61. to me, that rebalances the equilibrium in Europe, because Putin knows that if he did drop the bomb, then he could get the same back. And if you accept my thing about parity and equilibrium, then it won't happen. The French are very important to this. It's France and Britain who are the two nuclear powers in Europe. With America stepping back, in a way, you could, certainly from a perception perspective, you could think things are becoming unbalanced, and the mood music in the Kremlin might be, well, Putin's not going to back up. What is was it Hesketh or Vance called pathetic Europeans?
Pathetic freeloaders.
Absolutely, but that's the message that goes to Moscow. So the second thing is what was announced yesterday, is that France and Britain coming together. Now, in effect, one has always assumed that we would work closely together with the French on nuclear deterrent, but it's never been stated before, and it has now. And I think it's strong, because actually at this very moment, the French do have tactical nuclear weapons that they drop from their fighter jets. So it's going to take us a few years to get the F-35As, etc. It's a really good indication to Moscow we're serious about this. But actually, if something happened today, we could do nothing. Although, if something happens tomorrow, now we have this entente nuclear cordiale with the French. In theory, the French could use their tactical nuclear weapons, not in theory, but in practice they could. So the message to the Kremlin today is, right, the Brits and the French are working together on this. Forget the nuclear piece. So that's why I think it's really, really important. And I suppose the final bit, France and Britain, whatever the state of our militaries, and we've discussed, it's been discussed and written about it a lot, actually together, the sum of the parts are very significant. And certainly when it comes to leadership, the Scandinavian armies are brilliant, huge amounts of soldiers and hardware, and other European NATO countries, air power. But it actually it's ourselves and the French who have the sort of experience and the capabilities to bring that all together. So the sum of the parts of Britain and France coming together, I think, really strengthen the whole European defence. And I don't think that will go unnoticed in Moscow.
A lot has happened this year, and I'm interested to get your view. You're a man with a huge amount of experience, both on the field and off the field, commenting. We've had the Strategic Defence Review, we've had a rise in defence spending goals, we've had a lot of talk about the prospect of war in Europe beyond Ukraine, tightening of military alliance with Europe as the US potentially steps back. I'm wondering what you think has actually concretely shifted. What's actually changed, and is it enough to face the threat of Russia and further afield Iran, China? In terms of UK defence, what has actually changed, and is it enough?
I think we've got to hope it's enough. We have so spent our peace dividend that we are in massive debt, and it's taken. I imagine it's really difficult for people who who are struggling to make ends meet at the moment, who are, have a whole lot of issues vexing them. Why are we focusing on this? Well, quite frankly, everything else vexing us is irrelevant if we get our defense wrong. If we have to fight the Russians, then, we are back to 1939. We're back to at least a European war. And the only way to prevent war is through strength, and we never learn this. Because it's expensive, and politicians. I was always very frustrated as a soldier. Ultimately, you are doing what politicians want you to do. From a soldier's perspective, you want a decision made as quickly as possible so you can act. From a political perspective, politicians want to make a decision at the last possible moment. In case the situation changes, they don't have to do it. When you make a decision at the last possible moment, it's the worst thing for the military. And that's the sort of, hopefully it paints a little bit of a picture of where we got to in Europe. Because we cut down our defence, it came to such a position that on the 24th of February 2022, or perhaps before that, when Putin looked west, he didn't see a conventional deterrence that deterred him. And if you throw in the Obama red line too, he didn't think that we'd do anything anyway. So he cracked on. And all well and good. If we, I suppose, if we were super cynical and thought that Putin would stop at Ukraine, quite apart from any alliances we might have with them, then it might be fine. But he has told us that he's not. He's told us that he's going to crack on. The Strategic Defence Review is bang on. We need to have an army, a military that is capable of fighting the Russians, and we don't need loads of tanks. We need loads of drones, and we need loads of cyber. We need loads of special forces and security people and all that sort of stuff, which we don't really have. So that's a realization. However, it's got to be funded, and we're talking about 5% in total. But that money has got to come. I think that when you tied in the fact that Europe now realizes that we've got to do this potentially alone, and yeah, although whatever Trump's saying, I think if Europe did descend into the war, as has happened in the last two times, the Americans would come, because I still think interred in the US psyche is support to Europe. So, but having said that, we have got to show strength. So I think we're now showing strength. And when you look at the numbers, and I know this is probably not a great metric to use, but if you add up all the tanks, the fighter jets and soldiers in Europe, we dwarf the Russian military. And if you think the Russian military has been fighting for 3 years now, lost 1 million soldiers, fired gazillions of tons of ammunition, they're not in a great shape. Actually, the European army is well trained and motivated. So if there was a punch up, to use a very trite phrase, Europe should easily overwhelm Russia. But what we have, in order to prevent that happening, we must show the Russians that we're serious, because the final bit on this, we know that Putin exploits weakness, but respects strength, and we must show strength. And I think at last we are beginning to go in the right direction, but we've got to keep up the momentum, because any flagging will be exploited by Putin.
So you're not concerned that a lot of this is talk rather than walking the walk, because the defence spending that's coming in is a little bit speculative. 5% by 2034. Well, anyone can sort of commit to that and see what happens in the meantime. But do you think that talking, as you're saying, the sort of setting the mood, is the important first step to getting somewhere?
Absolutely. I think I've written in the past, without the money, this is meaningless. The British public have got to be convinced about this, on how serious it is. But it's a good first step. I mean, this time last year, we were really up the creek. At least now we've got a paddle and we're going in the right direction. But if we decide to lose that paddle, we could be back at square one. So we're in the right direction, but it absolutely must be funded. And we must really talk the right game, because that is the person we're up against. Putin is the one. Yeah, forget about everything else. I mean, we're worried about terror. We've just had 7/7, et cetera, et cetera. But it is the threat that we should be most concerned about. We can leave the Americans to sort out the Middle East and elsewhere in the Far East, but our most immediate threat is Putin. And we must show that we're up to it, and we must not only talk, but also produce the capability that we said we're going to produce.
Did you listen to the podcast War Game?
I have some of it, yes.
Where they war game Russia attacking the UK, and we don't come out terribly well.
Well, that's true. I mean, I think with all of these things, it goes back to one of my early points about psychology. And I think that is a key element that perhaps they didn't necessarily go into a huge amount of detail. But you go into anything, be it cricket, football, any sort of sport or any sort of battle, you've got to be confident. You have got to give that aura to your opponent that you are going to win. If you go into anything, with half full, particularly when it comes to something like this, you've lost before you start. So it wouldn't be a surprise, I hope, to anybody listening to this that absolutely, we're going to win. And we just need to make sure that our politicians give us the resources to enable that we can back up our statements.
So you're in Salisbury right now. Before you go, tell us a bit about your memories of that time. And I know you wrote a book about that experience.
What was very clear that the Russians, this was so planned by the Russians. We know about the two agents who were pretty inept, because we pretty much knew exactly what they were up to. I mean, not live as it were, but one could trace it back. But in the first 24 hours, and I do detail it in my memoir, Chemical Warrior, still available in all good bookshops, the Russians put out 60 pieces of major media that swamped the internet and swamped the news channels, saying that, this is Britain was doing it and we were killing Sergei Skripal. For the people of Salisbury, it was really damning. And I go back to the information piece. Because politicians don't like to say anything in case they get it wrong, it took about 48 hours for anybody to say anything from the government about what was happening. In the meantime, the Russians were controlling the narrative. And it's always been a great frustration. Actually, you guys would far prefer to speak to the chief of the general staff or senior military officers and all the rest of it. They're just not allowed to, because there's this perception that, they might say the wrong thing. But sometimes that fear of saying the wrong thing means if you say nothing, then somebody else fills the void. And that's my abiding memory. And the people of Salisbury were, it took 18 months to clean up Salisbury. But again, because of the fear of getting it wrong, the government wouldn't say, well, it's pretty clean. And of course, George Sturgis did die in July of 2018 as the sort of collateral damage that the Russians are so keen on. But after that, the chances were, in the millions to one. But the government, just weren't prepared to do that. So people in Salisbury were really worried for, 18 months or so. And there's still the aura. And in fact, when people come to visit, they go, can we go to Zizi's? Can we go to this, where all this happened? But the reason it was so significant is that it was headline news for 18 months. And if you're a tyrant like Putin or a terrorist like ISIS, if you could do an event that would keep you on the front page for 18 months, yeah, you would do it, which is why I am so evangelical, as it were, about getting rid of these weapons, because they are absolutely horrendous. But, we're slightly ignoring it in Ukraine at the moment. But if we do, it could really come and bite us.
Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, thank you very much for joining us on Battlelines.
Thanks for having me.
That's all for today's episode of Battlelines. We'll be back again on Monday. Until then, goodbye.